He is an advisor. He's been a member of our leadership council. He's an incredibly distinguished career, 30 years in the U.S. Air Force. He was the director of the NSA. After 6 years of the NSA, became the principal deputy director of national intelligence and then the director of CIA. And he's been at the center of our nation's intelligence community and played a leading role in the transformation of the IC and the expansion of its capacities to confront threats in the 21st century. And this is certainly during General Hayden's time that we've seen the elevation of financial intelligence as a major asset in the fight against terrorism, weapons proliferation, and drug trafficking, amongst other threats. From his position at NSA, ODNI, and CIA, he helped move the intelligence community in that direction, into the cyber age, and to understand the values, but also the vulnerabilities inherent in the interconnections between economic assets, critical infrastructure, and cyberspace. Since retiring from public service, he continues to lend his expertise and his voice on these critical issues. This past fall, I had the honor of testifying with General Hayden at a congressional hearing on Iran. Now, the great thing about testifying next to General Hayden is you can say anything you want because members of Congress are not listening to you. So I said the most outrageous things, and no member of Congress actually paid any attention to me. But one of the things that I was struck by in General Hayden's testimony at that time is his emphasis on Iran coming clean on its past and potentially ongoing weaponization activities, and the sheer lack of transparency in the Iranian nuclear program. General Hayden said at the time, quote, "Absent an invasive inspection regime with freedom to visit all sites on short notice, American intelligence cannot provide adequate warning of Iranian nuclear developments," which was quite a striking statement. And I don't know if you've seen the reports today, but there are revelations, we don't know if they've been substantiated, but revelations of an Iranian clandestine enrichment facility. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But certainly on the issue of transparency, there's also a great need for financial transparency to prevent rogue actors, including Iran, from exploiting global markets and engaging in illicit activities. So I certainly would like to welcome General Hayden to talk about the role of financial intelligence in the fight against rogue actors, and then we'll have a moderated discussion with you all. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General Michael Hayden.
Mark's given me permission to do it from here, so. And it's not a formal speech, but just a few comments. And Mark hit upon a couple of themes already. This whole question of financial intelligence. So in one sense, I mean, I've been more observer than player in this, or maybe more accurately, more support player than the main effort. And it's been a remarkable journey of discovery for me in terms of financial intelligence, sanctions, and illicit finance. So I'd just like to take a few minutes to kind of walk you through my growing realization of the importance and the impact of this. So my first contact with it is a little before, but really after 9/11 at Fort Meade at NSA. And you can imagine that I would routinely meet with our counterterrorism shop. What do you have? What are we seeing? What are we contributing? And so on. And you know, that could turn into just a hunt for anything. And you keep throwing things out. But these were very smart people. And they organized their hunt along three main axes, which was, I think, very, very useful. And it was follow the stuff, follow the people, follow the money. And it was those three directions that they then organized their signals intelligence search of what was, at that time, a very nebulous al-Qaeda network. And it was the convergence of the stuff, be it conventional or unconventional stuff, the people, the members, and then finally the financing that led you to a convergence and frankly has enabled us to, well, actually keep the homeland pretty safe against the kind of attacks we suffered 13 years ago, which are large, complex, slow-moving, and so on. That's a foreign intelligence function, and frankly, as good as we got at it, it wasn't this is going to sound trivializing it, and I don't mean this at all, it wasn't quite a higher order function. It wasn't leading to strategic analysis. It fundamentally was leading not up, but down. It was more about disambiguation and identification of very specific particulars than it was some strategic vision. So that's my first touch with it. Foreign intelligence, follow the money. The second, by this time, I'm coming to NSC meetings at DNI and at CIA, and this is all about the North Koreans and Banco Delta Asia, which was incredibly discovery learning, I think, for all of us. I'll give you my version. Juan and others more intimately involved will tell you, oh no, we knew this was going to happen. We expected this. This rolled out according to plan. All right? But we're there at meetings, and I'm going, well, what the heck? Harass these people. I like that. Shut down a bank. Yeah, they deserve it. I was personally unprepared for the strategic results of squeezing a few accounts at Banco Delta Asia and what that did for North Korean decision-making. I learned an awful lot about the fragility, if that's the right word, or maybe a better word is the sensitivity of the global banking system to reputational risk and how powerful a risk to reputation was in order to provide a lever to encourage financial institutions to do things in your strategic interest. Juan and I have talked about this. I think he's got a quote in his wonderful book, Treasury's War, in which I say targeted sanctions are the precision-guided weapons of the 21st century. Now, having worked with precision-guided weapons in physical space, PGMs are only as good as the intelligence that enables them. And this kind of targeting requires exquisite intelligence. And frankly, and this is a bit of a sidebar, but it's one that I wanted to share with you. That's a bit of a challenge. I will tell you without going into any detail that in order to develop the kind of exquisite intelligence we would need for that kind of exquisite and impactful action, I had to sit down with Hank Paulson on several occasions, whose vested interest in this is the integrity and the confidence that people have in the global banking system, and accommodate intelligence gathering with that absolute necessity. So this is not easy, I guess, is the point I want to make. Another bit of a sidebar, but I think it's quite useful. I didn't make Munich this year. Some of you probably did, the Munich Security Conference. I was there the year before. It was all Snowden all the time. I had lots of interesting conversations with my German friends, and they were raising the allegations that somebody may have been listening to the Chancellor's cell phone. Do you recall that episode? Yes. And my comeback was something along the lines of, well, I understand that, and Angela Merkel is certainly a friend. How about the other guy? How about her predecessor? How about Gerhard Schroeder? How about that €1 billion loan to Nord Stream and Gazprom? How about that cushy board position after he left government? What do you think? High-end strategy or something else? So, just drawing the point that this fiscal intelligence casts a very, very wide net. So you've got kind of the disambiguation, the counterterrorism for all the stuff, people and money. You've got Banco Delta Asia says, whoa, this is kind of an interesting tool. The next chapter in all this for me is Georgia. Recall the Russian invasion of Georgia in August of 2008? And frankly, I actually think our response to the invasion of Georgia was more robust than our response to the invasion of the Ukraine, but that's not the topic today. I don't know that our response was all that robust, though. It was hard to figure out what it was we were going to do in response to what the Russians had done. President Bush did not want the photo op of his boarding Air Force One and going to the ranch at Crawford while we weren't quite sure how far Russian armor was going to go south of Skinvali, whether it was going towards Tbilisi or not. And so his chief of staff, Josh Bolton, called me and said, Mike, the president's not going to the ranch tomorrow. He was wondering if it'd be okay to come out to the agency. And I went through the possible combinations of correct answers in my head and said, well, we could probably accommodate that. And he came out, and he went to our counterterrorism center, as you might expect. But then he spent an inordinately long period of time with our Russian people, our Georgia people, and our order of battle people. And I still remember it. We're in one of our conference rooms, U-shaped table, OB guys, Russian guys, Georgia guy, President, Steve Hadley, me, and the President in a dialogue with his intelligence analyst, just trying to figure out, what am I going to do about this? And I actually think the concept that came out of it, and I don't know if the President would record it this way, but the kind of the hard principle around which the conversation seemed at the end of the process to aggregate was the concept of inclusion and exclusion. You know, that here was a country, the Russian Federation, that wanted to be included in all those things that Paula suggested 60, 70 years ago, created in terms of the global democratic and fiscal system, Bretton Woods and all that sort of thing. And that actually inclusion in those things required certain norms of behavior, and you had to meet those certain norms of behavior. So we kind of marched around that inclusion, exclusion, which I think is really tightly tied to some of the things I think the center is going to be focused on. I guess the fourth thing I'd tell you in my own personal journey here is when I give speeches now, I talk about the second great era of globalization, the first one being the European discovery of the Western Hemisphere. And if you think back to your Western Civ or history courses, you realize how much that changed. I say we're now in the second great era of globalization. It's an interconnectedness, and I make the comparison that all those great changes in the age of sail and discovery, all those interconnections of civilizations that were previously separate was being done at 15 knots an hour with a favorable wind, and we're doing it now at 186 million miles per second. We are jamming together the good and the bad, the strong and the weak, in permutations and combinations we haven't seen before, and it is a nightmare for national security. You get out of that cyber attacks, transnational crime, and terrorism. But, and there's something that struck me, you get an integration of global finances and the global financial system in such a way that a nation like our own, which plays such a prominent role in commerce and finance, has inordinate influence that it can bring to bear in pursuit of its geopolitical objectives because of the enhanced interconnectivity. I'm just writing a few notes down, not many for today. The Soviet Union could be autarkic. The Russian Federation cannot. And that opens up an awful lot of opportunities with, again, if we can provide a whole of government or maybe even a whole of America approach to security questions. So, foreign intelligence, precision-guided weapons, inclusion, exclusion, globalization offers opportunities as well as threats. One final point with regard to that inclusion, exclusion. It can have a very positive dimension. I am as fretful as anyone in the room with Russian behavior heading down towards Mariupol right now. And frankly, if I'm in government, I'd probably be arguing at the table about really robust defensive weapons going to the Ukrainians. But I also know that the long-term resolution to this, that the long-term health of the Ukrainian state goes back to that concept of inclusion. In the same way that we're emphasizing exclusion to the Russian Federation for its behavior, we can actually strengthen the Ukrainian state in ways that arms, frankly, can't do by a steady, progressive inclusion of the Ukraine in this global fiscal system of democratic nations. So I'm delighted to be here. These are just my personal experiences, how I've begun to think about this. I am really appreciative that we've got a center under such good leadership that will think about this deeply and over the long term so that all of us can develop our scholarship on what promises to be a very influential tool for American security in the future. Thank you very much.
Great. So, General Hayden, I'm sure there's lots of questions, so I'm going to kick off the discussion maybe with one or two. It just sort of struck me as you were talking that you've been at the center of the national security establishment for a number of years. You look remarkably good for a man who probably had a lot of sleepless nights. And this really suggests the next question, which is, what's keeping you up? these days.
Well, the remarkably good thing is a 13-day cruise off of Australia. Okay? I am troubled by the changing threat actor, and you get the executive summary, but I think it's very important. The things that really can go bump in the night, and I'm worried about Iran, and I'm worried about the Russians and the Ukraine, but the things that seem to be neuralgic, that just keep coming at us, like terrorism and cybercrime and transnational crime, the Mexican loss of control of territory along our southern border. You know, we have a problem, we have a security issue on our southern border, and it has nothing to do with Mexican revanchism for Arizona. It has to do with Mexican weakness. Most of the problems that can most immediately affect us are not the product of malevolent state power. They are the byproduct of state failure or state absence. And the point, Mark, that I make is, but I grew up in a system that we all inherited that was created in 1947. National Security Act of that era, National Security Council, CIA, Air Force, Secretary of Defense, Joint Chiefs of Staff. We are hardwired to defend ourselves in this direction against malevolent state power, and that's still important, and we can talk about that for the rest of the day too. But now we've got these other threats coming at us from this direction, and I'm looking at Juan because we sat in the same meetings together. Most of the arguments we've had with ourselves, whether they're operational or budgetary or legal or ethical, in the last 13 years has been taking this structure and trying to make it do that, trying to make it defend us in this direction. And so the thing that keeps me awake at night, and I think it was Paula who mentioned it, talking about who shows up for NSC meetings. The wrong people are in the room for today's problems. Her point was Secretary of the Treasury is not a statutory member, but that's right. But if you accept this paradigm, there's a bunch of other people now who have a security function that perhaps wasn't nearly as apparent 75 years ago.
And General Hayden, you mentioned Banco Delta Asia, which sort of is an interesting case study. I know there's lots of different interpretations of, as you said, of what happened. But one of the interesting lessons of Banco Delta Asia, at least for me, is when is the right time to begin to relieve the pressure?
Yeah.
Particularly the financial pressure. And obviously we're facing that issue now on the issue of Iran. And obviously a lively debate in Washington about whether we should have escalated sanctions pressure or was this the administration right to de-escalate the pressure? And you've been dealing with issues of course of leverage for many years. What is your assessment, not only of Banco Delta Asia and Iran in particular, but more generally on the question of when is the right time to use coercive leverage, when is the right time to begin to diminish it as you negotiate with the likes of Vladimir Putin and Ali Khamenei and Bashar Assad and others?
Yeah. Well, you know, the correct answer is it depends, okay, which is not very satisfying, I realize. You've got a very powerful tool. It's designed to create effects. And it's easy. It was easy for me and others, I think, in government to, I don't want to say jump into a lane of morality and a Manichaean view of the world and good versus evil. But you really need to keep reminding yourself you're doing this for a reason. You know, you're not the avenging sword here. You are trying to affect behavior. And so I would simply say, Mark, keep an open mind as to when it is more or less pressure gets you closer to the goal of affecting behavior. And in terms of the current squabble about Iran, truly honest men, truly different as to how we got there and what we need to go forward. I am absolutely convinced it was the financial isolation of Iran that led to whatever level of seriousness we now have in the talks. I am less convinced simply because I don't have the data, okay, not because I'm hiding a conclusion. I am less convinced that I know right now whether to tighten that ratchet or not. I just don't know.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'd like to open it up to questions. Yep, this one in the back.
Hi, Akbar Ahmed with the Huffington Post. Thanks so much for this opportunity. General Hayden, we just have news from the Hill that Senator Burr isn't having an open threat hearing on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence this year. And I know you were talking about identifying threats that we're dealing with, sort of where things stand right now. I'm wondering what your view is on that as someone from the IC.
Yeah, I think, I understand what Senator Burr is doing, and it's not more or less transparency. I think it's a different format. You know, he had Nick Rasmussen up there from the National Counterterrorism Center. They got a day where they focused on terrorism, and I think he intends the heads of the three-letter agencies to each go up there in open session so they can have a narrowly focused session. The worldwide threat briefing suffered from 5 or 6 people at the table on how do you harmonize or not harmonize your testimony, who gets a chance to say what, who gets a chance to ask what, and so on. All that said, I actually think the American intelligence community would be aided by more transparency. And that's a political judgment on my part, back to it depends, all right? You know, as a pure intelligence officer, I wouldn't testify in open session ever. I mean, that's not what intelligence does, but I've never been a pure intelligence officer. I'm an intelligence officer of the United States of America. And we've got a political system in which both our overseers and the population need some level of knowledge about what it is we do. And we may have fallen a little short, not in an abstract sense, but in terms of the political culture, speeding beyond where the intelligence community had been in terms of that balance between secrecy and transparency. And so, although many in my old profession might prefer we wouldn't have to be as open as we will likely have to be, that's really not our choice. It's part of our political culture. In a democracy, public opinion matters. And that's what we should be doing. I should add, no other nation on earth does that. No other nation on earth has their intel chiefs up there in open session talking about worldwide threats. And it very often, often's too strong a word, it occasionally leads to positions very awkward for the people testifying and for the people asking questions, because of questions of classification, not of disagreement.
Thank you again, Raphael Danziger, consultant to APAC. And some people have said that the threat of terrorism is, of course, a very immediate and very serious threat, but it's basically a tactical threat, where the threat of a country like Iran, which is presumably working on nuclear weapons and on intercontinental ballistic missiles and expanding its influence in the Middle East and beyond, that's a much more strategic threat. How do you respond to that argument? Yeah,
so when I out of government, people would ask me that, what keeps you awake at night, come on, give a speech. And I usually had five things. 3 of them were non-state, or put another way, 3 of them did not depend on a state to be a threat. Cyber attack, terrorism, and transnational crime. The other 2 I had in there were China and Iran. Now let me immediately dissociate Iran from China, okay? China, emerging power, status quo power, great powers, new equilibrium, hard work, not the same thing as threat. Iran, danger, threat. And I commonly said of all the things I left when I left government, the one that's been in a downward spiral since I left government is Iran. And I'm quick to caution, this baby was not pretty when we left it, all right? We didn't tie this up in a nice bow and say, if you only do this, it'll all work out, all right? But we struggled with the problem too. And so I do recognize the seriousness of that kind of threat. And then frankly, I have, with great regret, have to throw the Russians and Putin in there now too, simply because of the destabilizing behavior that we've seen. So my new list would have 3 that were kind of the product of globalization and interconnectivity, and then 3 that were more or less traditional nation-state threats.
Great, we have a couple minutes left. Any final questions? Nope. Right here. One there and one there.
Bob McBrien. General, I'd like to return to a subject that was raised by one of the earlier panels, and that is the nature of the relationships and some of the things that have gone on in the, at least allegedly gone on in the cyber universe with Russia and China, and possibly Iran, and it's whether or not we're engaging in your view in some form of lower level actual conflict with them in those areas, or whether we're just being probed or having skirmishes, or whether something bigger is underway.
Yeah. The problem we have is that the kind of taxonomies that we've kind of worked out in these other domains, land, sea, you know, you do X, we know where to book X, right? We really don't know where to book X in the cyber domain. I do land, sea, airspace, and cyber when I give this presentation, kind of using a hand puppet up here, and say, we just don't know what of our experience up here, down here, can transfer up here. So the president describes the North Korean attack on Sony as cyber vandalism. I don't think it's an act of war, but I think cyber vandalism is more than a brick shy of a load in terms of describing what went on there. But we really don't have good language to describe it. For the most part, what's going on now is kind of the rough equivalent of high-end traditional espionage between states in times of peace. Now, it's on a different scale. It's got different targeting. But for the most part, I think we're kind of in that range of accepted international practices that we don't like. Okay? We are bumping out of that range, though. The Iranian attack on Saudi Aramco, Shamoon, wiping clean 30,000 hard drives. The Iranian denial service attacks against American banks. The North Korean attack against Sony, okay? A nation state conducting an American-based enterprise, attacking an American-based enterprise, not for profit, but for coercion. That's weird. I mean, so this is along a predictable arc. And we're moving out of that kind of a range of accepted international practices that we're uncomfortable with, but nonetheless acceptable. And we're now moving up into this range. And frankly, we don't know what to do about it. And I think our government, you know, we slapped a few sanctions. I realize that's a good word at this meeting, all right? We slapped a few sanctions on a few North Korean officials, but I don't know that it really pulled the choke collar all that much and got their attention.
Yeah, hi. Claudia Rosette with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I've asked Mark to forgive me for putting a very direct question to you, but this is a chance. My question, it's two-part, possibly related, I really don't know. But first is Iran cooperating with North Korea in any way in its nuclear program? Is there any reason to think that it is? And second, we had this extraordinary moment last fall when James Clapper flew to North Korea to bring back prisoners and came back and said they made him pay for his own dinner and told him he better leave right away because they didn't like him anymore since he, et cetera. Okay, first question is obvious. Anything you can say to address that? Appreciated. Second question, what did you make of that? Mr. Clapper's visit, thank you.
About Jim's visit?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, in terms of Iranian-Korean cooperation, I suspect there is on a range of matters. I cannot point to data that shows that, I cannot, all right? Keep in mind, I've been out of government 6 years, that points to data with regard to nuclear cooperation. All that said, it's really clear that North Koreans built a Yongbyon-style plutonium reactor in the eastern Syrian desert over a period of 6 or 7 years. So they're quite willing to cooperate with countries in the Middle East. And there was speculation while we were following this Al-Kabar thing, speculation all along that the Iranians were the bankroll for it. I don't know that, but again, it was one of the hypotheses that were put out there. I'm not surprised at all about what happened to Jim in North Korea. I used to negotiate with the North Koreans for a year and a half at Panmunjom, with the UN command and the Korean People's Army. the degree of cognitive dissonance that those people across the table from me had to manage, I think is biblical in proportion. What was that? Was there one last one?
Yeah, what was that about?
What, Jim going there?
Yeah.
Yeah. In my heart of hearts, and Jim's a good friend, Jim was important enough in appearance, but not a policy or political actor, that he could go there. The North Koreans would be satisfied that they've not been disrespected, but Jim had no authority to negotiate anything. So they told him to go home. I thought it was pretty clever.
Thank you, General Hayden. My name is Akshaya Kumar. I work for the Enough Project, and I focus on Sudan. So this is a question about how mass atrocity prevention, which our government has recognized as a national security priority and a strategic interest, intersects with counterterrorism, and particularly now the fight against ISIS. Recently, President Bashir went to the United Arab Emirates and spoke about how it might be time for Sudan to join the fight with Egypt and Libya against the Islamic State. And what does that mean for our relationship with the government of Sudan?
Yeah. Was it Samantha Power's book, The Problem from Hell, talking about genocide? So I understand the seriousness of it. But I think the intent of your question is, as we now focus on this terrorism threat, how much of past behavior are we willing to ignore in order to ensure certain patterns of behavior in the future? And how much can you afford to do that before you destroy all sorts of international norms against those kinds of past behaviors? And back to the answer to Mark's question earlier, it depends. I will point out that, and this included me at CIA, but I think it really included George and Porter before me, that the counterterrorism portfolio was so important, okay, that in many ways it pushed other considerations to the edge or maybe even off the raft because of the great focus on counterterrorism effort. I'll use an example, a little opaque, but with regard to Egypt. Omar Suleiman was a wonderful counterterrorism partner. He was the security chief there. He really was, and very wonderful interlocutor with the Palestinians as well. So there are a lot of good things about the relationship with Omar. Now, fair question to be asked. How much did the importance of that counterterrorism relationship, how much did that affect CIA interest in political opposition movements in Egypt and what they might mean for the future of that country? And how much did that focus affect American policy with regard to Egypt and individual discrete decisions that Mubarak was making? And I think the answer is, of course, it affected it. And now, how much and was it warranted? Good people differ.
Okay. I think, folks, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I want to thank General Michael Hayden for his time and his insights. I want to thank all of you for what I hope